Today, with us here to have this great conversation on how young people should fare in regards to the post-COVID economic recovery phase that we're entering is Carla Bernal with Open Heartland, Dewey Pham with CLASP, Elliot Smith with Repairs of the Breach, and Amadeus Oyagata with My Path. So to kickstart the conversation, we're actually going to go with Elliot to talk about the $15 minimum wage. So we know that frontline workers are the economic backbone of this country. And during the pandemic, they put their lives on the line to make sure our communities receive their basic needs and services. And yet we still have not passed a federal $15 minimum wage. So my question to you, Elliot, is as a young essential worker or workers that you have worked with or know, can you share what immediate impact this increase in pay would bring youth and young adults?
One of the things that we talk about in our analysis is that there are 140 million poor and low income people in this country. That's 43.5% of this nation. That's almost half. Half of the people in this country are poor and low income. You know, although Black and brown people are disproportionately affected by poverty, there are actually more poor white people, women and children, who are living in poverty based on sheer numbers, which is 66 million. So that's something that we have to keep on talking about, is that poverty affects everyone across race, gender, geography, creed. It has no boundaries or barriers. And so in terms of the fight for an increase in the minimum wage or living wage, what we see is, as of today, there are 60 million people in this country that earn less than a living wage. 60 million people. And so in no place in this country can you afford a 2-bedroom apartment off a minimum wage job. So people are basically working 2 to 3 jobs just to survive, like literally just to survive. And so the federal minimum wage has remained $7.25 for the past decade, when billionaires have increased their wealth by $1.3 trillion since the pandemic. Which is atrocious. It's policy violence, and really it's a grotesque form of inequality that we see today. We found out that an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour would raise pay for 59 million workers by a combined $322 billion per year. In addition, we also, in our analysis, find out that fair taxes on the wealthy, corporations, and Wall Street would generate as much as $886 billion per year in revenue to meet our urgent social and environmental needs. One of the things that we demand is an immediate rise in the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour for all workers, not in 5 years, not in 4 years, not phase over time, not index in one state or this state, but $15 an hour immediately. And we also demand equal pay for equal work, mandatory under federal law. And then lastly, we also demand the right to form and join unions for all workers, so that our most impacted have a say on the job and that they can voice what they're really going through, when oftentimes corporations and companies silence them when they're trying to organize for a better life.
Yeah.
And lastly, one of the things that we say is protect us, respect us, and pay us. Somebody's hurting our people, and we've gone on far too long. We won't be silent anymore.
And so, Carla, I know you've done a lot of great work, at Open Heartland as a young person involved in your community. How would you advise the current administration, Carla, around dealing with this housing crisis? Because they're not responding. They haven't really said anything about, helping people with this crisis that's looming over our heads. That is no fault of these people in their community of not being able to pay rent, or maybe even potentially lose their house again, like what we saw in 2008.
I'd really advise the administration to they could look into subsidizing some of these rent and utilities that they have, like they did for the businesses. Because if you look at it on both ends, the landlords aren't going to be able to pay up because they owe, but also the person who's renting their home is they're not going to be able to pay that much overnight if they're already struggling. They were already struggling once, and now with the COVID and the pandemic, it's really hit. And here in Iowa City, with derecho too, it's really a lot harder because of the natural disasters and all those things, those little things that become accumulate to bigger things, you know. And these families are just, I've personally and we've personally worked with families who have just had so much trouble paying for their rent, for their things. And yes, they may not, some people may have gotten their stimulus check, but not everyone. Those who don't are not applicable didn't get those stimulus checks, and they can apply here local, like for community organizations, but as well, like not all of them can apply to those because of some of their personal information that they're asking for, and none of them feel comfortable or none of them feel safe really to put that out there. Like if they're undocumented or if they're a refugee, they're not going to ask for help when they most need it because they're scared and they're afraid to ask for that help that they don't have. Um, there's really not, and like in the future, they can look into preserving more and increasing the resources for the federal affordable housing and like and make it equitable so that it's more easier to access for everyone. I think that's would really help.
No, for sure. And that's a great point. A lot of the landlords are asking for them to get bailed out, and most likely the government will respond in some way, like they did with bigger businesses. But they always forget the little guy, right? They're always going to say like, oh, well, it's interesting how they're telling folks, well, you should have had savings or something to be able to come up and pay for this back rent. But somehow a big corporation didn't have savings, and now they're bankrupt, and it's corporate welfare, right? Um, but thank you, Carla, for all the great work that you're doing to make sure that people are pulling resources from mutual aid, and I know you all are doing a great job feeding people as well. So thank you for joining us here today for that. And so I know we're talking a lot about some of the core issues and certain things that we could do now to really help out all our community members and the people with most need. But I also want to be able to talk about solutions, because young people are very dynamic, and there's a lot of people listening to this right now, and they're doing a lot of great things locally that most people might not know that they're doing, right? That they're working within community, they're strategizing, they're making ends meet, because they're not waiting for the federal government to provide them with a solution or for anyone to save them. So I'm really excited to then transition this conversation with an amazing group from San Francisco, and here to represent them is Amadeus with My Path, and here he's going to talk a little bit about some of the highlights of some great work that they're leading in regards for a youth economic bill of rights that is designed to target and help economically uplift specifically youth and young adults and support them with access to economic opportunities. So Amadeus, can you share maybe a couple of high points on the recommendations that you have for this youth economic bill of rights in addressing some of this economic crisis? And also for anyone who's interested in reading or supporting this great initiative, make sure to let us know where we can find you.
Of course. No, first and foremost, thank you, Madeleine, and thank you to the other panelists for being here. So hi, everyone. My name is Amadeus, and I'm the policy associate at MyPath. And we're a national nonprofit that works to build financial access and economic inclusion by and for youth. So we know that even before the pandemic, youth were facing systemic barriers in education, in finances, in employment, housing, and more. And there's a growing racial wealth gap. Though income is important, wealth, which is the assets that someone owns, is just as important for your financial well-being. It's wealth that gives something to pass on to the next generation. The chart that you see on your screen shows that the racial wealth gap is widening, and Black and Latinx households have consistently owned a fraction of the nation's wealth compared to white households. COVID has exacerbated racial disparities and created setbacks which our generation might not bounce back from without immediate policy action and targeted investments. So that's why we support a $15 an hour minimum wage, student debt cancellation, and rent mortgage moratoriums. And which is why MyPath's Youth Power Crew created the first ever Youth Economic Bill of Rights that will give all young people a real shot at getting on the right path towards building wealth. So we're pushing for the right to a guaranteed income with optional financial coaching. We're pushing for the right to help define the federal poverty line so that we have a real understanding of how many youth are growing up in poverty. And we're also pushing for the right to universal access to non-custodial bank accounts. This just means that all youth under 18 who are working can have their own bank accounts and have the tools that they need to get on the right path to start their financial lives. To see the rest of these economic rights and stay in touch, you can check us out at mypathus.org/youth economic rights. And lastly, I just want to say that the White House proclaims April as Financial Capability Month. But if we really want young people to be financially capable, we need youth economic rights first. So that's why I say this time next year, I think we should make March Youth Economic Rights Month. And yeah, I appreciate the time. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That's super exciting. And just a sneak peek for those watching this, there will be an actual recording of an in-depth conversation with Amadeus and his organization talking about the Youth Economic Bill of Rights. We'll make sure to share that link, but you can definitely hear more about all the 9 points that they have and the great work that they're doing. Just for the sake of this panel, we touched on very high level things, but look forward to hearing more about that work as well, and for all of you all to check it out, as well as his direct link to his organization. So we heard a little bit about, this is more of a local solution that y'all are working on, which is amazing. But at the federal level, we have some very great youth advocates making sure that we get the right information, that we get, that can really break down to us what is really coming out of the House and the Senate and the administration. So it is a true pleasure to then wrap up this panel with actually a friend and colleague of mine, Dewey Pham with CLASP. And also they're also working with the New Deal for Youth Changemakers to talk a little bit about what's going on at the federal level and what should young people know about. So, I know that the White House has announced one of Biden's core solutions to economic recovery with the American Jobs Plan. The plan aims to reimagine and rebuild a new economy that will create millions of jobs, rebuild our country's infrastructure, and give the US an economic edge over China. And so I'm quoting that from the actual statement from the White House. To break this down with us today, like I said earlier, is Dewey Pham. So what should we know about the American Jobs Plan, and what potentially can young people get from this larger piece of a pie of this opportunity?
Yeah, thanks so much, Marlene, and thanks so much, everybody. I'm really grateful to be able to participate and join you all today. Just for introductions, I'm Dewey Pham. I work at CLASP, Center for Law and Social Policy. We're a national anti-poverty organization, also focused on racial justice and racial equity. As Marlene said too, we also convened the New Deal for Youth, which you all have heard a lot about today. So I won't go too much into that, but talk a little bit more. And yeah, so as Marlene mentioned, we know that the American Jobs Plan is part of the Biden administration's promise to build back better. And just as Amadeus was talking about, we also know that before the COVID pandemic, young people, particularly young people of color, were being systemically excluded from economic opportunity. And so this kind of played out in multiple ways. Despite record low unemployment rates and declining poverty across the nation, people were always talking about how great the economy was, how we were experiencing record low unemployment. Young adults were experiencing higher rates of poverty and unemployment than any other population. So, for example, in 2018, 1 in 9 young people were not working or in school because of systemic barriers and divestment in their communities. These rates were the highest among young Native American youth. So about a quarter of, this is in 2018, so before the pandemic, about a quarter of all young Native Americans were not working or in school. 17% of young Black people were also not working or in school. And so again, despite this growing economy, young people, and especially young Black and brown people, we were continuing to experience economic, and also, as everyone sees every day, the physical violence in our communities. But then the pandemic hit and things became much worse. So 3 months into the pandemic, CLASP looked at some of the data, and we saw that about 40% of all young people were unemployed. And this is across race and ethnicity, this got much, this picture was much worse. We also, we know that young people were overrepresented in low-wage jobs and more likely to be impacted by the pandemic and closures. So about over half of all young Hispanic people, 48% of Asian American young people, and 45% of young Black people were unemployed 3 months into the pandemic. And what's even more about this is that, based on the data too, 90% of all unemployed young people did not get any income despite passage of the CARES Act, which was supposed to get, to really provide that economic relief in the form of stimulus checks and unemployment insurance and benefits and things like that. 90% of unemployed young people did not receive any of that. And with the pandemic, experts are estimating that a quarter of all young people are now going to be disconnected from work or school. So, like I said, even before the pandemic, young people were facing a crisis, and now here we are with the American Jobs Plan. It's an opportunity not only to provide overdue relief to the millions of young people, but it's also an opportunity for our nation to redress some of these deep-seated inequities that have existed for centuries. And this wouldn't be the first time our nation recognizes the need for a massive investment in people and the restructuring of systems and policies and structures. So after the Great Depression, many of us know that there was a recognition that we needed new systems, policies, and structures to build power among communities living in poverty. And what we got was a New Deal that essentially created and supported the current white middle class. And what we also know about this New Deal was that it excluded Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities of color. So this moment calls for the same type of investment, except centered around young people, specifically young people of color, and then we can start beginning to undo the centuries of systemic oppression. And what we really need is a New Deal for youth. And a jobs plan, economic opportunity and well-being is only a small part of this New Deal. We need young people to be safe. We need young people to have opportunities at healing and well-being. We need environmental justice for young people. We need immigration justice. But again, this is just a small part. The Biden administration is proposing a $2 trillion infrastructure package as a part of this first part of the Build Back Better plan. So the details here are slowly worked out, but we need to make sure that young people, specifically young people of color, are having their needs met with this proposal. A big part of this plan that we've been paying attention to is a call to invest $100 billion in workforce development that would pair job creation efforts with training programs in sectors like the green economy and sustainable energy, and also target workforce development to underserved communities. So this also includes a $5 billion to support evidence-based violence prevention programs, which signals the administration is thinking, what we've known all along, that jobs and economic opportunity make communities safe, not police or mass incarceration. So the final piece here is this plan also calls on Congress to create a new subsidized jobs program. This is something that we can really build on and making sure that communities who have been historically and systemically excluded from economic opportunity are guaranteed quality employment opportunities. This would include young people, particularly young people of color, people impacted by our racist criminal legal system, people experiencing homelessness, and more. So out of this plan, if there's anything we can pull from it, is that we need a jobs guarantee for, not just for the people who are impacted by the pandemic, but the people who have been excluded before the pandemic and who will continue to be marginalized after this pandemic is over. Again, this jobs plan is just the start, but it does signal a recognition for change. And as Elliot said earlier, we do need justice for all. And I'll just end by my last point here is a friend of mine, Jasmine Delafosse with the Gathering for Justice, always says to me, the best investment in people is an investment in people. And that's what we need right now, is an investment in people, an investment in young people, an investment of young people of color. And we can start here with this American Jobs Plan.
Our next question is on student debt cancellation. And here to talk to us about this important issue is Armani Jackson with NAACP Youth in College. So Armani, the latest news on Biden's stance on student debt cancellation is that he is considering canceling up to $50,000 in student debt per borrower, right? Considering. Warren recently stated that canceling student debt would make the biggest strides towards narrowing the racial wealth gap since the civil rights movement. My question to you is, what would canceling student debt mean for your professional financial situation? And what do you think about Biden considering canceling up to $50,000 per borrower?
For me, canceling student debt would mean financial freedom. As far as the Biden administration goes, I believe that the Biden administration should cancel student loan debt in its entirety. The NAACP right now, we're currently doing work around student loan debt cancellation. if you would like to be involved, or you want to be a student debt organizer, follow us on Instagram at NAACPYC_. Click the link in our bio, and you can too be a student debt organizer.
I think folks listening to this, you heard this loud and clear. We understand what the issues are. We have very concrete, small solutions as first steps. And we also understand the larger structural problem here and what we really need to address. And the common theme here is that we're way overdue on this. And in a situation where you have the opportunity to really invest in our communities, future generations, our local economies, we have to take that action, but that action has to go back to investing in our communities and individuals. We cannot continue to see all this money being spent on corporations and people who have, the ear of our politicians. And we're all watching and we're all seeing. I think in a couple of years, if that, we're going to look back during this time and we're going to figure out, was this all just a huge slush fund in cash for the people that really wanted it, or was this an actual investment for the future of those that need it the most? And so I'm going to end it with that. And thank you, all of you, for sharing a lot of these priorities for this population, because like you all said, this was an issue before the pandemic. It has only been made worse, and we have to make sure that we have an equal footing, to make sure that we have better lives for ourselves, our families, and our community. So thank you, everyone, so much.